The first thing I want to talk to you about is this recent visit you paid to Dilley, Texas. Is that the name of the
That's
town?
right.
Tell
Yeah.
me about that.
So, for the past 2 years, I've gone down to provide assistance to asylum seekers at the largest family detention facility in the United States. It's located in Dilley, Texas. It's called the South Texas Family Residential Center, which is a sort of euphemism. The people who work down there refer to it as the baby jail.
Ugh.
And this facility was opened in 2014 and has housed mothers and their children who have come up together from mostly Central America, but also other locations as well. And they are seeking asylum in the United States because of the various push factors that made them flee their countries and come here. Uh, there's a project, an immigrant justice project, that's coordinated by the American Immigration Council in Washington, D.C., RAICES, another human rights organization that focuses on immigrants and immigration issues. And for the past 5 years, they have been coordinating pro bono efforts. They take volunteers who agree to go for a 1 week period. And there are a number of important tasks that get done during that period. First, the people who are detained there will provide orientations to asylum seekers in group meetings called
Hmm.
charlas. They will receive preparation for an important meeting with an asylum officer called a credible fear interview. The credible fear interview is supposed to be a low-level initial screening of people to determine whether there is a significant possibility that they might have a claim for political asylum or some other protection under the U.S. immigration laws. There are a couple of other programs that are somewhat different than political asylum, but are equally offer protection, at least temporarily. So what we found last year was that about maybe 89% or more of the credible fear interviews were being approved, and people, once they pass their credible fear interview, they're allowed to be released from detention. Most of them have a sponsor in the United States who agree to have them live with them, that they'll take care of them until
Hmm.
such time as they're somewhat self-sufficient. And the asylum seekers at that point are able to pursue their asylum claims in a regular removal proceeding in front of an immigration judge.
Right.
So most of the cases last year were being presented, and the asylum officers were advancing them to release, family reunification, and an orderly process to consider their asylum applications. This year was like night and day. It was very different. Probably two-thirds or more of the same types of claims are being denied.
By the same people, the same officers.
Some of the same officers, but there have been personnel changes now. More and more, what we're seeing is that, for some time, they have relocated asylum officers from around the country to go down there for temporary assignments to work these cases. But now we're seeing that they are actually deputizing officers with the Customs and Border Protection Agency, the Border Patrol officers, are actually being assigned to do these credible fear interviews. So this is kind of like the fox in the hen house determining what should happen. It's an officer who has already decided that they shouldn't be allowed to come into the United States, and that's his or her job. And then they're passing on these claims, whether someone has a significant possibility of being able to make out a claim. So more than ever, we have many fewer asylum seekers that are being released for an orderly asylum process.
Well, you go down there as a volunteer lawyer. What can you do if the deck is stacked against you like this?
Well, it's really difficult to do much. As a lawyer, well, if someone does not pass their credible fear threshold interview, they are then allowed to request a review hearing in front of an immigration judge. There are no immigration judges in Dilley, Texas, and the whole place is, kind of like a detention compound. People cannot leave. They live in trailers in a secure facility, and there is a court trailer. So the attorney can go into the court trailer with their client, but even though, well, the law is different for people who are in credible fear hearings than in regular
just want to come to this country and relocate.
Right. There is no right to counsel. They are allowed to get information and counsel, but your attorney doesn't have the right to participate in these review proceedings.
So you can have an attorney to give you advice, but when it comes to appearing before one of these judges, you're not allowed to be a part of that.
That's
actively. Correct.
Now, as a lawyer, it's hard to sit still as a potted plant. And
no.
So I do my best to be heard when I think that it may help. So during the week that I was there last week, I did appear on 5 different cases where an immigration, let me just set the scene. You go into this trailer and it's set up kind of like a courtroom where there's a table and you're sitting next to your client. In front of you is a large television screen, and a judge is on that screen sitting somewhere else in the United States. In this particular week, these cases were heard by a judge sitting in New Mexico.
Okay.
And so you have a not perfect technological system where sound may cut out or visuals may become pixelated. And so you have this sort of shape-shifting picture of a judge on a screen and a sometimes time-delayed audio quality. And the judge has been given the notes of the asylum officer. And there is no, like in a regular court proceeding, you might have a court reporter, or you may have a recording that can be turned into a transcript of what was said during a hearing. There's none of that in credible fear interviews. What you have is an asylum officer conducting an interview and taking notes during the interview. So when we then later on read what happened at the interview, there is no transcript. There is only the officer's notes that are not a transcript, not necessarily accurate, rely on a translator sometimes whose interpretation.
This sounds Orwellian. I mean, this really sounds like some sort of dystopian future.
You got it. It is very much the reality that when you enter into this world, it is one of, the national security state guarding against the masses seeking to come into the United States. In addition, whereas last year we saw that immigration judges reviewing these would allow people, they would vacate a negative credible fear determination by an asylum officer if they saw that the asylum officer did anything not by the book.
Mm-hmm.
This year, things have changed with the legal system because of initiatives by the administration. There have been several initiatives and changes in policy and interpretation of the law that have made it much more difficult for people to get past this credible fear stage.
Scott Pollock is an immigration lawyer, has his own firm, Scott D. Pollock and Associates, and he just came back Saturday from doing some pro bono work at a family detention center in Dilley, Texas, and we've been talking about that and how in the last year the personnel evaluating people and the judges evaluating people have shifted. It's as if, at least as far as the judges, that they've been cherry-picked to do this work, to say no to as many immigration requests as possible. And these aren't just people who want to relocate. These are people who fear for their lives. I mean, Scott, this must have taken an emotional toll.
It does take an emotional toll. There is always the possibility of sort of secondary trauma being experienced because you are discussing some really difficult situations with your clients. Mental health professionals also go down there and work with some of the people. But the trauma to someone like myself is minimal compared to what's happening to the families themselves. They've escaped from terribly violent, brutal situations, and then when they get here, there is no welcome mat for them. They are put into these very isolated areas. Dilley is an hour and a half south of San Antonio. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's a very small town. It's probably one of the biggest employers in the area. But people are there from weeks to months, and kids who are always traumatized by being in institutional settings, they have to sort of witness and hear what their parents are going through again when the family is being interviewed and you're trying to get their story to help them tell their story to an asylum officer or a CBP officer who is making this very critical decision about their future.
And the Trump administration is making changes to essentially make it harder and harder and harder. Who's doing these jobs, who the judges are hearing these cases. It's like they're trying to gut the system from the inside out.
Yeah, there have been a couple of changes over the last 6 months that have made a real sea shift in how we approach these cases. One, of course, is the so-called Remain in Mexico policy. Many fewer people are being allowed to even proceed to a detention facility in the U.S. They're being forced to live on the streets of Matamoros and Tijuana while they await initial screening from overwhelmed Border Patrol officers to decide whether or not they can even come in. What is resulting is there's a lot more family separations. You've got some cases where fathers are with children and they're allowed to proceed to the interior. They're given paperwork to show up at an immigration court, whereas the mother and other child are being separated from them and being either kept in Mexico or, if they're lucky, allowed to come in and stay at the baby jail to go through this initial screening. But we saw many situations of family separation as a result of this Remain in Mexico policy. the other really unbelievable shift is that several months ago, the Trump administration announced that if someone has passed through a third country to get to the United States, they must apply for asylum in that third country. So if they're from Honduras, they'll be traveling overland through Guatemala and Mexico. If they have not tried to get asylum in Guatemala or in Mexico, they are categorically kept from applying for asylum here. They have to qualify for a different kind of relief, which has a much higher standard. And in addition to that policy change, these immigration judges are employed within the Department of Justice. That means that their boss is the Attorney General of the United States. So a lot of the newer judges have been hired since Jeff Sessions was the Attorney General, and now William Barr is the Attorney General. And these are some of the most politically activist attorney generals that we've seen ever in terms of issuing new policies, overturning decades-long precedents in order to cut off these kinds of claims.
There has been speculation in various articles that part of the reason why Jeff Sessions recused himself from the Russia investigation, the move that totally infuriated Donald Trump, part of the reason he did that is because he did not want anything distracting him from these changes that he wanted to make in immigration and how the border control works, how ICE works. He wanted to focus so deeply on that he didn't want to waste any time on the Russia investigation. And that was supposedly from people who have been in positions near him, was part of his thinking on why he so quickly and rapidly recused himself from the Mueller investigation.
Well, it's certainly clear that his record on immigration was pretty devastating in many ways. He issued quick decisions on who did not qualify for asylum, people who were fleeing gang violence, which is one of the huge push factors from the Northern Triangle countries, requiring people to save their children by leaving their country. Also, trying to categorically deny domestic violence claims, which had been a recognized social group for asylum. And so a lot of the cases that we see that used to be recognized as valid reasons to protect people, now all of a sudden they are being seen as not qualifying because of these changes that Jeff Sessions made. Now, since William Barr has been Attorney General, he's really in the same mold as Jeff Sessions in terms of his immigration restriction.
What were some of the reasons, the clients that you worked with in this last week, what were some of the reasons they'd applied for this asylum?
Well, the conditions in the Northern Triangle countries, at least parts of them, are so unbelievably bad. You have non-government actors, gangs, many of which started up in the 1980s and 90s from people who had been deported from the United States, who'd grown up here, and they were deported back to their countries. They established power centers, and at this point, they actually control a lot of territory in some of these countries, and they exact taxes from people who live there. They are sadistic, and they one story that I heard a few times this time was people who had been, if they refused to join the gangs or if they refused to pay taxes to the gangs, and these taxes are not like what is being proposed in the United States. These are like, we are going to tax you more than you could possibly ever make at your vendor's stall in the Sunday market or whatever. We will kidnap your children. We will kill you. We will sell your children to the narcos, the drug traffickers. And this is happening. People are terrified. People's houses were broken into. One case where it was known that the police would support the gangs in their shakedowns of people in the area. In this particular case that I was consulting on, the gangs actually took over the houses of several blocks in this town and forced the people who lived in the houses to leave, to go elsewhere. And they said, if we see you here again, in some cases, if you do not leave the country and we find you in the country, we will kill you, we will take your children. So this is one of the ways that forces people to take care of themselves, to leave, uproot themselves from their country. There's a wonderful poem called, I think it's called The Shark, and it's about how no one leaves their home unless they are going to be eaten by a shark or they are in the shark's mouth.
That's one of the big myths, that somehow all of these people are coming here to scam us. They're coming up to the United States because they want to apply for, welfare, and they want to take American jobs, and that somehow that they're doing it just almost on a whim. Do you know anybody, no matter how poor you are, who would just pick up and leave your home on a whim?
No, they are pushed out of their homes. And the thing is, asylum seekers are not a threat to the United States. They are, if anything, part of the essential fabric of the United States, our history. The Statue of Liberty's guarantees to resettle people who have been tempest-tossed and arrive here with nothing. What we're finding with immigration policy these days is the exact opposite, where we only want to accept the wealthy or the super successful billionaires. And it really is a change in America that I'm observing in terms of policy. And I think that people have to be really paying attention to what's going on and talking to their congressional representatives and say, we won't have this. It's really important that we resist the changes that we are seeing going on these days.
Has the practice of child separation finally stopped?
Well, no, it hasn't. Of course, the government will say there was never a policy of child separation.
Yeah.
There was only a policy of enforcing the law. But that is, very disingenuous. Enforcing the law is a policy choice, especially with low-level misdemeanors, which was the law that, unlawful entry to the United States at other than a port of entry, designated port of entry. It is a misdemeanor. And so the Jeff Sessions policy, the no tolerance policy, zero tolerance policy, certainly has its rationale, but the agencies that enforce that policy, they'll say, well, we took an oath to enforce the law. They do not consider the consequences, the trauma, the fact that children were going to be and were separated from their parents, in some cases irrevocably so. Kids who are now have been living in foster care, who will probably be up for adoption. The lawyers that sued to stop that policy have been trying to find parents for months by sending people to Central America. They're going from town to town in Guatemala trying to locate some of the deportees because the government didn't keep clear records.
They didn't keep even the most, like if you go into the hospital, you get a bracelet. You know, it's got your name, it's got the information you need. There wasn't even the slightest effort to have record keeping here. And I have been reading more and more that some of at least the toddlers and the infants that were separated are now being put up for adoption, which is just so horrific. It's hard to wrap your head around that. I talked to somebody from Alex Hernandez, who writes for Borderless magazine.org, and they profiled some of the people who are in this area who are seeking asylum, and they profiled a woman who had her 3-year-old taken away. They were eventually reunited, but she told Alex, the boy I have now is not the same boy who was taken away from me. He may never be that boy again. It's just nightmarish. Grab your headphones here. We have a listener who wants to join our conversation. Hi, Michael. How are you?
I'm doing fine. How you doing?
Good. Did you have a question for Scott?
Yeah, not more like a question, more like, affirming what you guys are talking about. I'm living down here. I'm from the United States, but I'm living in Tijuana. And a lot of people are coming to the borders. We've been inundated by Central America coming to the border here and trying to get asylum. And a lot of the people, the reason they're running from this is because of, the environment. They're not getting very much rain. The gangs are taking over. President Trump has stopped aid to Honduras and Central America area. So what are they going to do? They don't have no food, no shelter, and what's left is run by gangs.
Yeah, I've also heard
running away.
Yeah, I've heard that the climate change and the droughts and the conditions that have affected the crops and ability to earn a livelihood in Central America has been more and more recognized as a push factor for people. As you mentioned, in addition, you've got these societal factors where the gangs are themselves active in trying to pressure people to either join them or to fund them, and all of this combined, well, you see it probably every day on the streets.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I see people begging for food every day on the streets because they escaped Honduras and the Central America area there. And, at first, the Mexicans were helping them. Then later, the Mexicans started complaining about them because, in Spanish they call them cochinos, because they only wanted pizza, soda, and stuff like that, because they never had that stuff, or it was very expensive where they were. So when they were coming up, most of the stuff they wanted, but it pissed the Mexicans off. I'm sorry, did I say that? It made the Mexicans upset because they're coming through, they only want the best stuff, and then they throw all the food that they're donating to these people on the ground. They're not even eating it.
Wow.
And so they're not getting any help from Mexico. They're getting some help because the president down here is doing a fantastic job in Mexico. But they still need more help. They need work.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael.
That's all they're going to the United States for, is to get work and to keep their family safe.
Thanks so much for calling, Michael, all the way from Tijuana. Another firsthand account of what a mess it is down there at the border. Scott had just spent the better part of a week down in Dilley, Texas, where there's a family detention center trying to help some of these people navigate the system. How successful were you, Scott? What was your batting average?
Oh my goodness, not very good this year. Last year it was, like I said, about 90 or more % of cases were given positive, credible fear results. This year, probably 2/3 or more are being denied. And of the 5 cases that I went in front of a judge to get review to see whether or not it was a fair hearing or not, the judge affirmed the negative fear determination in 4 out of the 5.
Wow. That's amazing. And the stories are just amazing. Grab your headphones again, Scott. We've got another caller who's calling from Wheeling. Hello, Roosevelt. How are you?
Hi. Thank you, John, for taking my call. Scott, actually, I had a statement for Scott and a question. Scott, what detention center in what town? Is that close to Hidalgo, Texas?
It is specifically in Dilley, Texas, which is halfway between San Antonio and the border, like Brownsville and Harlingen.
I know the area. Yeah, Harlingen, McAllen, all that. Okay. Well, here's my question, Scott. What do you know about Border Patrol agents, or maybe not the agents themselves, but the ones that are in charge of the detention centers taking advantage of little girls? That's one of my questions. And another statement that I had was, I think part of the reason why they're having such a hard time reuniting the kids to the parents is their governments have abandoned them, thanks to policies that were set in place in the 80s via Reagan's policies. And as long as our country got what they wanted, their governments are very corrupt, and they have abandoned their own people. Therefore, if they cannot protect them, how can they reunite the kids?
Well, it isn't the governments of Guatemala and Mexico that are separating kids from parents.
No, right. But what I'm referring to is they're trying to reunite the kids that they separated, right, back to the parents, or in other words, trying to get the kids to, put them back. I know they deported the parents, so they're trying to reunite the kids to the parents, but yet their own governments have abandoned them. In other words, they don't protect them from those gangs and those corrupt young people that are down there and have taken over. So what I'm saying is that they're in limbo, meaning their own governments don't protect them, their own governments don't help them.
I think you're right, and I think the government's ineffectual ability or lack of ability to stop the gangs and rein this in is part of the whole problem. I don't think these are particularly effective governments that we're talking about here, Scott.
No, and there's collusion between government officials and police officials and the gangs themselves. It's the corruption goes both ways. The police receive money that maybe their governments are not giving them. One of the clients that I interviewed and assisted to get a review testified that she saw in this building gang members and police officers in the town exchanging clothes, so that the police officers actually were giving their uniforms to the gang members, who would then break into people's homes and either shake them down or threaten them or commit terrible acts of violence and rape in the homes. And when the people saw that, well, the police are at the door, they're more likely to say, well, they're not going to harm us, but they're not actually the police.
Real quickly, let's address Roosevelt's earlier point. Are there incidents of abuse at detention centers in the United States? And if so, how prevalent a problem is it?
My understanding is that there have been incidents, and actually in this detention facility that I was at, there were wall posters everywhere saying that ICE has and Department of Homeland Security has no tolerance for abuse, for sexual abuse whatsoever, and that if there is any inappropriate behavior or touching, they want to know about it. So there is active discouragement going on, which is a good thing.
Yes.
One of the unfortunate consequences for people who go in order to assist the asylum seekers is that there are strict rules against not touching any of the detainees. So we could shake people's hands at a distance, but if they even sought to hug us, we had to raise our hands and not engage in any physical, affirmative physical contact, because there is such a concern that it could be construed as abusive touching.
Well, I suppose you've got better err on the side of caution, huh?
Yes, but on the other hand, you are, especially with the kids, the kids are very active, very physical when they're healthy. One of the problems in the facility is that like upper respiratory illnesses just sweep through, and when that happens, the kids can get very sick and very lethargic, and it's a scary situation. That was how it was last year when the weather was uncharacteristically cold and rainy, and it seemed like everybody was coughing their heads off, and it was scary to be even in an enclosed space interviewing them. This year, people were thankfully much healthier, and the kids were like running around, and it was a much sort of sunnier, if I could say that, feeling because the kids were doing better. But a lot of them were very taken aback by what their parents were disclosing. We often had to send the children out of the interview room so that they wouldn't be exposed to what was going on, and then they would get freaked out and miss their parent. And some of them were just naturally affectionate kids, right? So they would come and hang on you or whatever, and you could not do anything. Or if someone needed consolation or consoling, it had to come from their family member or another detainee.
Let's go to Brad, who's calling from Elk Grove Village. Hi, Brad.
Hi, Joan. Here's my comment. It's a little bit long-winded, but I'll try and keep it brief.
Well, we're running out of time, so speed it up.
Donald Trump and his followers represent a very religiously hypocritical form of ugly Americanism, and here's what toward especially the Hispanics, but a lot of other immigrants. Jesus said, "How you treat the least among you is how you treat me." The other part is this: capitalism. This country was built by immigrants. It's kind of like I saw Hamilton. Immigrants, we get the job done. But the thing is, that's what capitalism requires for a lot of its profits: a cheap labor pool. Who is in our restaurants? Who is in our hospitality industry? Who is obviously landscaping? Who is in our metalworking plants? Look, there's hardly any Anglos there, except the ones that you run up against at the front desk, or maybe who are serving you. But that's my point. And all of this bigoted, racist, ugly Americanism is completely antithetical to what these religious right people supposedly should be believing and behaving like. And
Thank you, Brad.
I'll make my response off air.
Thanks. We're running out of time there. Thank you for your comment. So, Scott, talk about the project in our remaining minute and a half here.
Oh, thank you for that. Yes, the project is called the Dilley Pro Bono Project. It's a project of the Immigration Justice Campaign of the American Immigration Council, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, and the American Immigration Representation Project. And it desperately needs more volunteers. It will be one of the most life-changing events that you could go through to spend a week down there, especially if you are bilingual English-Spanish. They need people. You don't have to be a lawyer. They accept people to come down as interpreters for non-Spanish speaking lawyers. And a lot of non-lawyers actually get an opportunity to do the credible fear interview prep sessions for the detainees.
So do you have a website for people can go to?
Yes, I do. You can go to www.immigrationjustice.us, and you'll see information about what what you can do for the project. Of course, there's also a link for donations. And
always.
Yes.
You always need money. Thank you so much, Scott, for being here.
Thank you, Joan.
Scott is the founder of Scott Pollock and Associates, and they do a lot of immigration law and a lot of pro bono work. And I'm so happy to have this conversation with you. And, you know, congrats on the good work, and hope it gets a little easier down the road.
Me too. Thanks.
Yeah.